Hey folks, we wanted to try out something a bit different today here at Timescale. So we're very happy to have a guest to talk about one of the blog posts he's written about Postgres, as well as his broader experience as a CTO, CTO coach, and an avid Postgres user. Just as introductions, many of you know I'm Mike Freedman, the co-founder and CTO here at Timescale. I think this topic is very relevant today because, as many of you know, Timescale started by solving some hard IoT sensor data problems. We were drowning in data, so we ended up building a very complex stack that included at least two different database systems, one of which was a time series database. And so we reached so at some point, we reached the breaking point with this very archaic, bespoke, complex architecture. And we said, why don't we just build a time series database right in Postgres? This was in 2016, and as we went through it, we finally launched what became TimescaleDB in 2017. And it turned out that resonated with people, this simplification inside a time series database. And now, of course, Timescale has millions of databases in our community and thousands of customers using today who rely on it daily for their time series and event data. And last year, we started to expand. We launched Timescale Vector, making Postgres even better for vector data, dynamic Postgres for relational workloads. So thinking about moving this as Postgres for time series to Postgres made powerful, which brings me back to today and seems super relevant. Very happy today to have Stephan Schmidt, who wrote this amazing blog post on his blog, AmazingCTO, called Just Use Postgres for Everything, which I could say really resonated with us here at Timescale. So I thought we'd have him today on and to talk both about that article, his experience, and I think he has an upcoming book soon to come out, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But Stephan, do you first want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Stephan. I'm a coder by heart. I teach myself programming 40 years ago as a kid. Did a lot of things, and did a lot of things. And in my progression through technology, I also touched Postgres several times. Before it was Postgres with SQL, and then several times in startups and in companies. And today I'm a CTO coach.
I love that. Did a lot of things. Sounds like hard-earned scars over the years.
Yeah, you can see from my hair and like this.
There you go. So you wrote this blog post on your blog, AmazingCTO, and it was titled, Just Use Postgres for Everything, How to Reduce Complexity and Move Faster. Could you talk a little bit more about, what motivated you first to write this in the first place?
The thing that motivated me to write this in the first place was from my coaches. I wanted to have a place where I could point them to and other people point to, where I've written up all this stuff that I'm talking about. So that was the initial idea, and I just wrote it down and published a blog post. And then still today, if you put in just Postgres in Google, it's the top spot. So that's how it happened.
Yeah. Well, that seems like some good SEO there, if nothing else. But I mean, obviously that's what you started coaching, you just described this was a message you kept giving again and again. And so it's obviously worth writing about it. But, maybe more, why is this the message you gave again and again? What did you see with a lot of these people you were coaching? What they were doing versus what you thought was what they should be doing?
So I'm coaching people in fast-growing startups. So not in large enterprises, but in fast-growing startups with all the challenges they have. And one of the challenges everyone has is that their tech stack is too complex. So they build up a very complex thing in the beginning, and then it's hard to maintain. It's hard to look into security. It's hard to scale. There are so many different things that can break. And also in the tech stack, if you use Redis and Postgres and Kafka and some other stuff, the interaction between these moving parts can become problematic. So you might have some stuff on your server, and then you run into Linux problems because of TCP/IP running out of buffer or something, because you have too many moving parts. And this is where they struggle. And then I recommend usually to get things much simpler. And one way to make things much simpler is to remove a lot of these moving parts and replace them by Postgres.
You know, it always sounds good to have simpler, but I'm sure you also sometimes get pushback says, yes, but, you know, Postgres is my OLTP database and Redis is my memory cache and Kafka is my queue. So, you know, what's your response when you generally get that type of pushback?
I usually don't get that pushback from CTOs because they are the ones who have the problems. Yeah. But I get a lot of pushback from the engineers. Yeah, they need to be convinced because it's nice to have this zoo of technology and learn about new things. And it's fun. It's usually what brings people into the profession, being curious about technology. And so they want to experiment. They want to play with things. They want to use things. They want to learn and grow. So the main resistance is coming from engineers, and they need to be convinced in some way, usually replace that what they have with something that's also interesting. Like, and I usually suggest having deep features, working on deep features that are intellectually stimulating instead of having a large technology stack. But from CTO, there's usually no pushback. It's usually for engineers.
When you say working on deep features, do you find it beneficial, you know, deep features in their problem domain, the specific product they're working on? Or do you also mean that even when you standardize on Postgres, it ends up being deep features that you could also leverage inside kind of the Postgres stack?
Both. So on the one hand, for example, let's take search. Too many companies, I think, on startups I work with, search for them is having an input field, getting the data, the search data into Elastic, and then displaying the results. So that's the search usually. But if you go to Google and you put in 1+1, it's not searching for 1+1, but it thinks, okay, 1+1, I should calculate it, and outputs 2, it might print in calculator. So that would be something, having a deep feature. And even as an engineer, you can create more complicated features that are stimulating and great for the customer, instead of just having a shallow feature, which means taking the input field, going to Elastic, displaying the results. So that's a deep feature from the domain, but also why go to Elastic if you can have full text search or vector search in Postgres.
Gotcha. And so that's a good example. So you mentioned full text search and vector search, as opposed to, let's say, of having, you know, Postgres and Elastic and something else. Maybe you could, you know, normally when people think about Postgres, they don't normally think of it as a replacement for Elastic. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about how you could make Postgres a replacement for Elastic.
So in the past, Postgres by itself has already some full text indexing search features, which are usually good enough for if you start with a company and for the first search, usually what Postgres brings to the table is good enough. Then there are some extensions which you can install to have better full text search, full text indexing in Postgres data. But what I have seen in the last, usually in this year, I'd say what I've seen in this year is that a lot of my customers are moving to vector search. To instead of having a full text search like in the past, they are moving to a vector search to have better search results in their domain. So that's what they are using usually.
Totally. Do you want to, I mean, I think we sometimes hear about vector search in the context of generative AI. Can you talk briefly about vector search more broadly, but also specifically how that relates to Postgres versus something else?
So vector search, as you mentioned, I think there are two areas where my customers are using it. One for AI and storing AI data or models, but on the other hand, they also use it for similarity search and try to find, like, going from a full text search to having a similarity search for search results. So to get better results essentially for their customers. So this is how they use this. And they use this, I think, they are driven by AI, but they find out that they can use it for other things too. And there has been a surge of vector extensions in Postgres in the last 6 months, I think, like a kind of explosion in the space. We'll see which of them makes it, but there has been an explosion in the space. And that has been driven Postgres users to evaluate vector search for their domain problems.
Right. I think, when I started looking at the use of vectors for similarity search as opposed to kind of exact match text search, I thought one of the really interesting things was that it allows you to group together concepts. And so, one of the examples I always love is, they sometimes says, American England or American Europe, two countries separated by language. We might in the US here search for soccer, and hopefully it'll match on things, called football. Now, of course, from a text perspective, those have nothing to do with each other. From a concept perspective, they're almost identical. And I think that was one of the interesting things I've seen about vector search.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But going back to the concept of, so, I know of, you mentioned, I think there's an popular open source extension in Postgres called pgvector. I know here even at Timescale, when we built Timescale Vector, we actually built it on top of pgvector, then just, really, expanded it for scale and performance. But going back to your story about Postgres for everything, there's also like a total number of databases in standalone vector databases, Pinecone and Quadrant and Weaviate and Chrono. And, for a while, it was like every week I heard about a new standalone vector database launching. So when you talk to your CTOs, beyond this vector base or that vector database, why Postgres for vector data as opposed to one of the 20 new vector databases that are out there?
I sometimes say Postgres is the new Linux. When Linux started, it's not replacing Linux, but when Linux started, and when I was using Linux, there was 2 files, which was boot 𝗔𝗲𝗃 and root 𝗔𝗃. So there was no distribution, so we had 2 disks. And at that time, it was a minority, and people used a lot of different Unix systems, SGIs, IRIX, IBM AX, Suns. So there were a lot of different, very specialized, for example, in the case of IRIX in SGIs, very specialized Unix systems. And Linux replaced all of them because it did all of that, what the others did. Perhaps not in the beginning, not as good as these, but it was just convenient to have one system, and it was free. And so for various reasons, Linux replaced all the other Unix systems. And I think Postgres is kind of the same in the last years, perhaps not in the beginning, but in the last years, it got a lot of momentum. And I think it will do the same to a lot of databases and NoSQL database and stuff we have seen in the last 10 years that Linux did to the Unix systems before. A lot of people already have Postgres. They have Postgres knowledge. They have people who can manage Postgres. There are a lot of hosting opportunities where you can just go to a managed database. And so these are reasons why I think where people go to Postgres, same why they go to Linux instead of having some specialty database.
Yeah.
Sorry for my English.
No, it's great. So in terms of examples, so obviously we all think of originally Postgres as a relational database and transactional workloads. Here at Timescale, we've worked on these time series and events, basically Postgres as a operational analytical database, event database, database, analytical database. We talked about for search, search database, you don't need Elastic, perhaps. We talked about for vector, you don't need a separate vector database. What are some of the other areas that you say, just use Postgres as opposed to build your own? And maybe we could dig a little deeper in 1 or 2 of them.
So my personal story, a little bit injection about my personal story. We used, in the startup of my wife, we used a NoSQL database. And then at one point, we decided it was no longer a good fit. So we migrated to Postgres. And just use, because at that point also JSON-B to store JSON data in Postgres was good enough to create essentially the same document database as the NoSQL variant. And in that way, like that might be 2017 or something. I also encountered TimescaleDB, and we use TimescaleDB to store search results, so we could do analytics for our customers, how often they were in which search. So this has replaced NoSQL and some other stuff we were running. And what we were also running back then is, and a lot of people do this, is they have some kind of cron jobs, like sending emails or some kind of cron job. And then you need to maintain a cron infrastructure. Either you use cron or you use a tool for this, but then you need to have some distribution and you need to manage it. And so one other thing is you can use pgcron and do some, which goes a long way for a lot of people to do some cron stuff, which all of the startups and all of the companies I know need in the beginning, some way to run stuff at midnight or, and if it's like, I don't know, analytical setup or something. So this is something that people use. And also, I think it's also good there are a lot of different solutions to run queues in Postgres. So depending on if you need a message queue or if you need a message broker, there are different systems. But I use a lot of Go, and for Go, there is something that's called River, and that's using that's implementing a queue system in Postgres. And that works fine. I think with the arrival of some Postgres features which enabled proper performant queue operations. So this is another thing.
So maybe you can get rid of your, so it sounds like you said you can get rid of your NoSQL database with Postgres. We know that Postgres is web scale given how many people run it. But it sounds like you're also saying that what you've seen is even some queuing discipline, using some tools like River, you could implement.
If you're really large, sorry, Chuck, I didn't want to make the wrong point, but if you're really large, you probably need Kafka or need to have some replay abilities and something. So you really need this. But a lot of people reach out for this specialized tools too early. So that would be my point.
Yeah, no, I think I've sometimes even said this internally that, often I think sometimes developers, because it's kind of the shiny thing, like to reach for the tools that were kind of built by the 1% or the 0.001%. At Google scale, at Meta scale, you're going to need radically different, more complex things. But probably the vast 99.99% of companies aren't operating at Google scale, Meta scale, and therefore can maybe I think you've said like radically simplify the type of stacks they do by not trying to put together 10 different technologies to build their backend, I guess.
Yeah. Yes, and because one thing I also tell people a lot is we can't look into the future. Like if I could look into the future, I would play the lottery. I don't. So I can't look into the future. And developers, I think, try to, for various reasons, mostly for risk reduction, try to look into the future. And so they try to build something that's needed in 10 years. So in 10 years, you might be Google, but you're not Google now. But they build something with this in mind already now, with a kind of vision into the future, but this makes everything hard to move. So you can't react to the market or to changing things. If you're nimble, if you have only Postgres, it's very easy to add something. The market, your product changes, the market changes, your customer changes. You need some new technology. It's very easy to add that technology. But if you already have a stack of 10 pieces stuck together, it's very difficult to add another one or remove one and add something new or move to something new. It's much more difficult moving to something new than adding to something new as the future progresses and your situation changes. So, yeah.
Do you typically, I mean, with that idea of like building for the future, do you typically often, tell the CTOs you work with what timeline to think about? Probably thinking about 1 week or 1 month is too short. 10 years, 5 years is probably too long. Like what type of way do you reason about, or do you need to do that at all? And in fact, until you're a certain scale, just pick Postgres and not worry about it. Like, how do you recommend people think about that?
In the beginning, I'd use Postgres and not worry about it. It just works. Usually there are two things in my experience, and different people have different experiences, but there are two things, which one is Redis, which is just start and forget. And the other thing is Postgres. If you have like backup and all the stuff configured correctly, it also just works at some point. Scaling wise, I encourage people to build something that could scale 10 times. Like if you like build something and you're confident that this system you have scales 10 times, then you're fine. And then if it's only 5 times, then you need to think about, okay, where do we move next? And I also encourage people to have a tech strategy in mind and say, okay, if it happens, then we'll do this, then we do this from what we know now. But we don't do it, we plan to do it. And then if the circumstances change, we do something different. But from my experience, people do not look into 10 times scaling. They always go into, okay, with this setup, we could scale 1,000,000 times. Or like they have 1,000 customers, but they plan for 100 million customers. And that's out of proportion.
Those are the most frustrating POCs we sometimes work with users, where the gap between what they have and what they're trying to design for, I have also seen 1,000,000x differences in what they need today and what they're trying to plan for. And what's interesting, what I found is how much Postgres can scale on modern hardware, on a modern cloud architecture.
Yeah.
I could speak with our own anecdotes that one of our own insights products that we build that basically powers the observability platform we offer on our cloud to all of our customers is actually backed by a normal Timescale service. So it's TimescaleDB plus Postgres running in our cloud with all of the additional features that we built. But people think, can Postgres scale? Well, this is a service that our own customers can use. That's what they offer. And that's ingesting 10 billion records a day and is about, I think this month will pass a petabyte of data all in Postgres. And so it's amazing on how far you can even scale before you might need to go through this really complex, sharded manual, yada, yada, that people often start on day one.
Yeah. And about the sharding and the failover, from my experience in smaller companies, if you're not having 1,000,000 customers, if you're below 1,000,000 customers, the problem often that come out of failover are bigger than Postgres failing. So there's a higher probability that your failover fails because there's a heartbeat problem or like there's a fake failover and stuff. So the problem that arises from implementing failover are often more problematic than the problems that, for example, Postgres creates, which is kind of tragic, but that's how it is, I think.
No, that's fair. I definitely know that, when you start running many thousands of databases in your fleet, you also see the long tail of all the issues that you could encounter when it comes to, building automatic HA. So I totally appreciate that. What was interesting in bringing this back, you talked a little bit about, deep technology or deep features that engineers can work on, and also how you could kind of radically simplify some of your backend by really just using Postgres. I guess the question, either from a business, product, whatever, what have you generally found the outcome? What has that enabled when, teams don't worry about, what's the famous Stanley Kubrick movie? When I learned to stop worrying and love the database or something is, I guess, going to be my word for that today. What can they do now with that?
Developers have a limited time, so they have a limited capacity. So if they need to, like running all of this stuff takes time, even if you have it managed. But it takes time to understand. It also has I think the point was made in the team topology book about the capacity and mental load you have for things. And if you have too many things, your load is too high and your capacity is down. And so you're not able to do new things or do things differently. because as a developer, you're blocked, or the organization or the team is blocked because it's working on too many things. And if you have, like, it's just the minor things, but if you need to understand how, well, this interface works with Elastic, this is how Postgres, might have an object relational mapper or ORM system. And you need to understand this and this and this and this. And then if you want to change something, you need to understand all this stuff. You need to build up a mental model again to change it. And this takes time. And if things are much simpler, you can just put more effort into delivering value for product or in the end result for the customer, instead of being tied up with technical problems. And then if you run into technical problems, for example, if you need to upgrade something and it's not as easy to upgrade to a new version, it takes some months to prepare and work on that. So if you have several of these systems, different systems, it just takes away development capacity. And why do this if you're not producing value? And especially in where I work in fast-growing startups, it's always on the edge between becoming a unicorn and running out of money. So, like, also from a casino film quote, why risk it? So, why risk your company?
I love the old engineering phrase yak shaving. You start down the path of upgrading this one thing, and then you find yourself doing something more and more, and it's not actually making progress on doing work. I love your example of mental model. I actually think that's one of the superpowers of engineers, is once they develop a deep mental model of the technology and systems they run on, they really can do so much more in using it. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
One of the questions I always like to ask people when it comes about Postgres is both favorite feature, if you will, favorite tool, favorite whatever, as well as what's your one wish it had that it doesn't. So let's start with the favorite.
So I'm working on something new on the side, might become a startup, obviously using Postgres. And for the first time, I've used the PG upgrade, I think, and on my development machine and on my very small company deployment. And it worked so flawlessly. I was amazed. Like, obviously, it's not a terabyte database and things, but on the scale I have, something small, it just went flawlessly. I was amazed. Upgrading, stopping, upgrading, cluster changes, config. I think it was from 15 to 16 or something. So that was astonishing. Then a feature I could not live without is JSON, storing JSON data, because I'm I think you need to have a mixture between what do you store in a relational schema versus for what do you have the schema inside your application.
Yep.
Having the schema inside your application lets you iterate faster on some things, but it takes away some kind of on rigidness and security. So you need to make a backup. But I'm a huge fan of storing partially domain data in JSONB. So that I could not live without. I think a feature that I wanted for a long time is just built-in failover. That was something that I wanted for a long time. I was in a startup. We were struggling because we had so many millions of users. We had a MySQL cluster, and we struggled with failover setups and heartbeats and things. And so I think something out of the box that just works. That's something I wanted to have, and I think that's something a lot of people want to have if you read Hacker News or something. But from what we talked before, I'm no longer sure it's as much needed as I thought 5 years ago. So my answer 5 years ago would definitely be out of the box, easy failover setup. Today, I'm not so sure anymore.
And is that because you think that the infrastructure has gotten better, or because the thing has moved that a lot of people are using managed services in the cloud that then take on that complexity?
Yes, that's also one point I encourage people to use. I think you need to make conscious decisions what to move into the cloud, and because in cloud is quite expensive, so a lot of my customers move to the cloud, then at some point move out, then at some point move again in. But I suggest everyone uses a managed database.
Gotcha.
So yes, yeah.
And companies like AWS and Timescale take on them the burden of guaranteeing
Yes.
availability.
Yes. Because of the upgrading and because of the failover and because of a lot of and backups and a lot of things that you can get right, but it's also easy to get wrong and then you're screwed because
Yeah,
it's your data.
I mean, the example you gave of, and sometimes I think it even self-managing gives people this false sense of security because it looks really good at 5 GB of data. It's
Yes.
really good to make a 5 gig database work well and seem fast. When you get into terabyte, tens of terabytes, hundreds of terabytes, hundreds of thousands of database objects, millions of database objects, that's when you like, it takes a little bit more care and a little bit more expertise. And if you're not careful,
Yeah.
things are really bad.
Yeah. But people, I see people recognizing this because their queries are getting slower.
Yep.
Often what people don't look into is like restoring data. Like, they did do some restores and that works fine. And then the database is 100 times larger. And then they have a critical incident. And then they need to restore stuff. And then suddenly it takes a day. It's not taking a day. Today I read an article about how fast copy data into Postgres, and also Timescale was mentioned in that article. So for special tooling, but then that's what people do often forget because it's not on their it's not daily pain. Queries are not, getting slower. So you see them, but you might not do a restoration every day. I urge people to restore the data every day to see if it works and, and not be confident that it will work when you need it.
Yeah.
Check restoration of data or restoring data every day. But that's sometimes where people are surprised
No,
with the amount of data.
We live through that all the time, and we sometimes see that, oh yeah, I've been using Timescale self-managed in production for 5 years. And then you realize like, oh, what backup? And you're like,
Yes.
okay. Changing topics a little bit.
Yes.
You also, I believe, have a book coming out next week, I believe, talking a little bit about the journey. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about what the book is and also what the thesis is and why you wrote it?
So the book is called AmazingCTO, and the subtitle is currently the subtitle might change last minute, but currently the subtitle is The Missing Manual for Managers. I found in my coaching and talking to CTOs, there are a lot of books that are technical about architecture, about processes, about a lot of technical topics. There are great books. Will Larson, for example, writes excellent books on the topic. Elegant Puzzle is one of my favorite books. But what I found is that a lot of other stuff that makes you kind of amazing or successful in the role is beyond technology. It's some simple things as being on time in a meeting or having a meeting agenda and all of that stuff, or how to hold people accountable. All the stuff people are not talking about and you're not reading in a book. So I thought that is a book that needs to be written. And I wrote that book, and now it's 140 rules about like how to manage people, how to hold people accountable, about delegation, about all of these topics that's outside of technology, but that are crucial to the success of being a CTO.
Who do you think this book, beyond either current CTOs or aspiring CTOs, it sounds like that's broader about leadership and management. So who do you think would enjoy this type of book in your learnings?
Because there are some technical parts in it, and there's also a long appendix with a lot of hiring checklists and a lot of diagrams and stuff. So currently, you need to have a technical background and be an engineering manager to take the full out of it. There might be a version in the future which is called Startup Manager or something, edited to being suitable for CEOs. Currently, the focus is for engineering managers, mainly for CTOs because that's the people I deal with, but it's also good for VP of engineering or head of development, or up if you're a team lead. I think it's very useful for that role too.
And if fast forward, a year or so after you have this book out, what would you be most excited about the results of this? What would have brought you the most joy or a sense of um, accomplishment with it?
Um, I was inspired by this for this book some years ago by the best boss I ever had. She was so great, and I learned so many things from her and from her behavior and from how about being a manager. Um, so I would, if I meet someone, or if I meet people and their boss has read that book and they can experience the same thing I experienced with my boss, that would be great, because I think people deserve good managers, I think.
It sounds like you obviously had a great manager and mentor. Was there one or two things rather than 140, but one or two things that even years later really resonated with you?
I think the main thing she was responsible for, she told me some things about myself where she said, you need to change this and this and this, otherwise you will not progress. And she was right. And she helped me tremendously changing these things. And that really unlocked some potential. So that was great. In a minor fashion, it was um, not dealing is the wrong word, but interacting with your direct reports. So there is the situation where I should create a presentation for the board, and it went between her and me 5 times, and she put the stuff in and moved stuff out and moved the stuff in that she moved out. And so it was a very tedious process for me as the one writing the presentation. But in the end, I was happy, she was happy, and she was confident I could present to the board. And this is something I give to my coaches, that you need to support your people with tedious things sometimes to make them better. And it's like, if the presentation is not, their presentation skills or the slides are not good, then you need to give feedback and again and again and again until it works. Sometimes people just say, oh, that's not working, I don't like that. And then the person goes back, but you need to really making your direct reports better is putting effort and work into it. And then you benefit from you greatly benefit from your investment over time.
Yeah, that reminds me of, you probably know, beyond being a CTO here at Timescale, I'm also an academic and a professor, and the mentoring problem of working with graduate students, particularly in the beginning, is almost like the old apprenticeship model. You're a lot in the weeds, helping write papers, and it's really through that experience, I think, that you help some other people also grow.
Yeah, I think so.
Stephen, it's been a great pleasure having you here today. I greatly enjoyed. Of course, the message Postgres for everything, or just use Postgres, really resonates here with us at Timescale. It's something that we are firm believers on, have been working on for about almost a decade now. So, I just wanted to thank you. And I believe your great, amazing CTO book drops April 23rd. And I think if people are interested, you have the amazing domain ctobook.dev, where people could look up and find information on the book. Otherwise, thank you for coming on today.
It was a great pleasure. Could never have imagined 10 years ago when I used TimescaleDB for the first time, 10 years later talking to you. So great pleasure. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much.